Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, are you as thankful as I am that we were not treated to an overtime today?
Yeah, oh my gosh. What an ugly game. The last 2 weeks of primetime football, obviously Vikings included, have been awful, which, if that's the price that we have to pay for those first 6 weeks being, like, truly excellent, I guess it's worth it, but, like, man, I don't like actually paying the price and sitting through it. That was ugly.
Yeah, that was, even when Eli and Peyton are having trouble with it. Man, that and I don't know why anyone's really this surprised that the Chiefs aren't good. If you look statistically back at Super Bowl losers, the team that loses the Super Bowl more often than not doesn't end up making the playoffs the next year. So
it's very weird. Like I don't like that statistic because there's not like a great explanation for it.
No, it really is just about as non-existent a stat can be. Like it's
right.
About as superstitious a stat as one could exist.
Yeah, it's wild.
Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well and doing better today than you were on Sunday night while watching the Vikings lose to a backup quarterback. We will have plenty to talk about. We're going pretty much all mailbag for the review, so strap in. This one's going to be a good one. And we'll talk about that along with the injury to Danielle Hunter and what that means for the rest of his season. But before we do, again, just want to thank you guys so much for listening to Norse Code. If you enjoy the show and would like to donate financially to the show, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. That's more of a subscription sort of situation where you do $3.50 per month and you can donate and get bonus episodes there. Or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well. That's more of a one-time donation. Or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com like so many wonderful people have and pick up your Arif Christmas socks and shirt and baby onesies over at norsecode.threadless.com. Every time I get an email saying we got a sale through the store, I just laugh. It's
delightful every time. I agree.
Yeah, it is fantastic. The image is great. Drop Play Dave did a hell of a job. So check it out. We are now entering the Christmas season now that we are entering November. We are also entering prime turkey take season, so we will get to that soon. Not this episode, but we will get to that soon. So check that out as well. And just a brief reminder, the next show that you hear from us is going to be our live show over at Ireland's Four Courts over in Arlington, Virginia. That is going to be fantastic. Got a bunch of people that have said they're going to be showing up to that. You too can join us. We're going to be doing a live recording and then posting the show up on all the regular podcast aggregators shortly thereafter, basically when I get back to my hotel that night. So check us out. It should be awesome. Head out there about 7 o'clock or so. We'll probably be starting just a little bit after that. So they're going to be giving away the Nova Vikes Facebook group is going to be giving away a few things. We're going to be giving away a ticket to the Ravens game. I found while I was moving a thing that I'm going to be giving away as well. I believe it's a Dante Culpepper 2001 bobblehead. I don't know why I own this. I just know that I do. So I'll be giving that away as well. So check it out. This is going to be on Thursday. So I believe that's going to be November 4th. Yes, November 4th at 7 p.m. Show up, have some fun, have a couple of drinks, have a little bit of food, and get into an argument with Arif in person.
Oh boy, I feel like that's only really happened maybe once. And it was like very lighthearted, and it was an Iowa-Minnesota thing more than a Minnesota Vikings thing.
Yeah, I think I was the one who ended up getting into the argument with the at the last live show about UND hockey versus Duluth hockey. So yeah,
which rules?
Well, yeah, that was fine.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
But anyway, if you are interested in such things, check us out. It should be a blast. We're also going to be over at JMU's homecoming that weekend as well for Arif's Dukes, for everyone's Dukes, really. But
for everyone's Duke, our Dukes,
the royal we. we'll be heading out there as well. So if you're going to be in the neighborhood, check out JMU's homecoming. That should be a lot of fun. Before we start, we do have a couple of people to thank for donations, including a new Patreon subscriber, Adam Gabor, who says, grew up in Minnesota, left a long time ago, and now in the DC, Maryland area, and planning on attending your live stream event at Four Courts Pub with my father. I can't explain why I remain a Minnesota Vikings fan. I'm not a masochist in other aspects of my life, nor, for that matter, can I even rationalize why I'm a football fan. Brutal sport with an atrocious track record and many of the things I care about. But alas, it is what it is, and I am who I am. And so long as that's the case, one thing I can rationalize is donating to the podcast that delivers the goods and analysis, entertainment, and shared pain. Looking forward to meeting the crew in person and commiserating with other Vikings abuse victims in the DC area. Keep up the great work. A fantastic way to put that.
Wow, that was good.
A couple of PayPal donations as well. DJ Sobish gave some money for adhesives because halfway during the show, all of my foam fell
Incredible
off.
Move.
Yeah. I got a text from him too. It was like, use it. I was like, really?
That's amazing.
I like how he sent it to the show. Not to me personally. He sent it to the show. So
yeah.
Dwayne Oyen.
Get it on record. No, for sure.
Exactly. It's like, well, this is going to get mentioned in the show. Dwayne Oyen. Norse code is very important if you live in Maryland, where the football team has illicit purple jerseys. I completely agree. Nick Torborg sent a message and said, the Loch Ness Monster must be kept at bay. Thank you so much for the donation. Appreciate it. And Benjamin had an interesting one with his donation. He actually has a question, and Benjamin asks, is Kirk Cousins vaccinated at this point? He doesn't wear a mask during pressers, which I thought was a requirement of unvaccinated players. If he is, can we assume this happened immediately prior to Zimmer praising Cousins' leadership all of a sudden?
That's interesting. I feel like we would I think the Vikings would want for us to find a way to find out if he was, because the Vikings do not love the attention that Cousins gets for not being vaccinated. So I'll say that. I'll also add that for the in-person pressers in the meeting room, I don't know why, but players that I know for a fact are not vaccinated do not wear the face masks most of the time for those pressers. That includes players like Dalvin Tomlinson, who, when I last checked, was not vaccinated. It includes a couple of other players that have done pressers that I am fairly sure, but obviously can't be 100% sure, are not vaccinated when that presser comes up. There's also a similar question that I've had to answer a number of times now, so I'll just do that here. When you see players on the sidelines not wearing a mask, if they're active on game day, they don't have to wear a mask. If they're inactive and are not vaccinated, and depending on the rules of that particular state, so in Minnesota, for example, then they do have to wear a mask. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I'm not going to tell you that there's a good reason for that distinction, right? But that's what it is. And so hopefully, most people who follow me on Twitter don't listen to the show. So I understand I'll probably continue to get this question on Twitter, but hopefully this will at least stem the tide of that question. No, when Adam Thielen and Kirk Cousins are on the sideline, the fact that they're not wearing a mask is not indicative of anything in particular. Also, I'm going to add, I think the fact that the Ravens wear a dark purple jersey, I think that's part of the reason that we don't see as many old school uniform version of the Vikings. I can't say for a fact if I know that that's the case, but I just feel like if there were only one purple team in the NFL, they would give that team a lot of latitude on whatever shade of purple they wanted to be for a throwback session or for a brand change or whatever. So I'll say that. I just wanted to add that on because I normally don't talk during the Patreon session, and I had my mic muted then, so I couldn't interrupt James.
Well, these things happen. You're not used to it. It makes sense. Speaking of the whole purple jersey situation, a couple of friends decided that what I needed desperately was a white away jersey for the Vikings this year. So I'm going to be debuting my CJ Ham jersey. I ended up getting that as a gift here. So I have a white CJ Ham jersey because I wanted to stick out and not be wearing purple. So I'm hoping that ends up being at least hilarious to a few people that are walking around with a giant guy with ham on his back. So,
Well, yeah, but now they can blame you, right? Because the Vikings overused the ham.
well, as I said on Twitter, I happen to be the biggest supporter of ham outside of the pork industry. So I'm aware of the situation, and I'm aware of the stigma that comes with it, but here we are. All right, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Again, hope you guys are doing well, and let's get into the biggest news after the loss was the injury to Danielle Hunter. And this was originally something that was thought to be a shoulder injury and now has turned into a torn pectoral muscle.
Yeah. I guess we'll learn more. I don't think we've learned the results of the MRI yet, but that's the fear that the Vikings have. The MRI, I think, was supposed to be this morning, but either way, Mike Zimmer confirmed that it was a torn pectoral tear and that Hunter might be out for the rest of the season. So whether or not we have the actual results of the MRI in front of us or whatever, it seems like the Vikings are very willing to share the fact that Danielle Hunter is going to basically be out for the entire season as a result of a pectoral injury, which kind of reminds me of like that rash of pectoral tears back when Evan Strong was the strength and conditioning coach for the Vikings. But kind of doesn't matter. Either way, Hunter was having a pretty good, not like amazing season based off of kind of what I was watching in training camp, but a very good season. Probably like an outside shot to be one of the better edge rushers in the NFL. And obviously like that's going to be a huge problem because Everson Griffin's been playing well, but Hunter is part of the reason. I mean, he was drawing a lot of attention, chips and double teams and stuff like that, and was forcing opponents to throw faster. So huge problem for the Vikings defensively. Now for the next couple of weeks, they won't have Patrick Peterson or Danielle Hunter. And then, of course, for the rest of the season, they also will not have Danielle Hunter, period. Yeah, I think if the Vikings had won this game, which we'll obviously talk about in more detail, this would be a good time to talk about panic trades, which they are known to do, usually before the season, but sometimes during.
So this really does change the whole look of this defense. This is something that is not, this is the sort of thing that you worried about with his neck, not something you were expecting for like a pectoral muscle or shoulder thing. And it's too bad because this is supposed to be his prime. This is supposed to be the time that he is going to be the best he's going to be. He is about to get paid, likely, and man, this Everson, you said it exactly correct. Everson is succeeding because of Danielle Hunter. The players on that line are having success because of the attention that Danielle Hunter is getting from this. So this is just too bad. This is going to have a significant effect on that line and the shoddy defense that has existed. They don't have much to do with the corners, but man, this is brutal.
and it's very clear that to the extent that the defense was successful, like a lot of it helped like the Vikings had like the third best pressure rate in the NFL, right? Coverage helps pressure, and pass rush helps coverage, so they're all like related, right? So you can't say one thing is solely because of this or that. But obviously, Danielle Hunter was the big producer either indirectly through drawing attention or directly through his sacks and direct pressures. And without that, like one of the league's best pressure rates, without the ability to generate that pressure somewhat quickly in the snap, like it was kind of interesting. I was talking to Seth Walder, who does the ESPN pass rush win rate stuff, and Hunter doesn't rank very high there. And I was like, well, that's interesting, right? Because the PFF grades for Hunter are very good. Like obviously they are, right? And they don't tend to give a lot of credit to defensive ends who get pressure very late in a rep as a result of coverage. So what do you think is kind of the issue here? It was kind of like an open-ended question. He was like, well, this is interesting. Hunter is maybe the best in the NFL at generating pressure at the 2.5 second to 2.7 second window, right after the pass rush win rate stat cuts off. And so he doesn't get counted in the stat because there's kind of this weird statistical quirk. But, for these longer developing players, he's better than perhaps anybody else at that particular thing. And if the Vikings coverage has the ability to kind of hold up for just that long, or if they can encourage opponents to run longer developing plays by putting them on 3rd and long, or finding ways to encourage them to run play action as opposed to straight dropbacks because of really good linebacker keys or whatever, right? Whatever it is that they need to do to force opponents to take longer developing drops, Hunter is among the best in the NFL at disrupting those particular types of passes. And so not having him, like you said, very much alters the nature and the structure of the defense. If you can't have him win off the edge and win right away and impact the way that teams kind of game plan, then the way that you want to structure that defense, the way that you want to call your coverages, the way that you want to do all this or that, changes really dramatically in a way that losing someone just as productive like Everson Griffin, but not as impactful in terms of the way that they alter the structure of the defense, just doesn't have. So it is a huge blow for the defense in ways that go beyond his direct ability to generate pressure.
Well, if you're listening to this, you most likely watched the Sunday night game and have formed an opinion as to what the Vikings should do next after losing to a backup quarterback, having an incredibly anemic offense, and allowing all of Dallas's receivers just to, you can catch it. We'll get you in like 5 yards. It'll be fine. Like, just ridiculousness overall. But what we're going to do is, in the spirit of who do we blame for this, we're not going to do we're not going to do who to blame. We are, however, going to do what do the Vikings need to do next. And we've got 4 options here. And Arif is going to be debating the one person on the planet who he feels is up to the challenge of debating him, which is himself. So Arif, the first question for what the Vikings need to do next, or the first answer rather, is fire Zimmer and Rick. What say you?
Yeah, no, obviously you have to fire both of them. I mean, Zimmer and Rick are kind of a package that have been tied together. That was kind of the deal that the Vikings had when they extended Rick Spielman. He's got 2 years left on his contract. And obviously Zimmer and Rick have kind of worked off of each other, and they've built their philosophies around each other. And the type of players that are being brought in are built off of the types of players that Rick Spielman brings in. And obviously they're coached around the types of players that Zimmer wants to have. And you need to fire both of them, in part because in order to kind of get over the hump, in order to take advantage of talent, you need to have a coach that has the ability to finish and win and not have like a Marvin Lewis for years and years and years. But you also want to get rid of the general manager because I think we're getting kind of sick and tired of only being, all right at the draft, being really great at trades and value, and then producing players that are not all that great and living off of your past successes. Like Zimmer, or rather Rick Spielman, is extremely good at figuring out ways to draft 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round pass rushers, an extremely important position on the defense because they hit a couple of times on late round pass rushers. Between Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter, it was nobody. And then after Danielle Hunter, it's been nobody. They had to bring back Everson Griffin because they haven't been successful at finding mid to late round pass rushers, and they've fallen into these habits. It took forever for Rick Spielman to realize that just because they drafted John Sullivan in the 6th round and Brandon Fusco in the 6th round doesn't mean that they can continue drafting interior offensive linemen in the late rounds and have them hold up at an NFL level. And of course, what does he do? He drafts Garrett Bradbury to do it. And the best interior linemen that the Vikings have drafted are players that Rick Spielman did not even realize would be interior linemen when he drafted them. That's not a credit to him that he found Ezra Cleveland and didn't know what to do with him, didn't understand whether or not to have or keep or fire Riley Reif. And it's not a credit that Oli Udoh, who's a great find, obviously, was somebody that they wanted to be a backup tackle and that they were forced to put into the guard position. And now Oli Udoh, of course, isn't even all that good at guard anyway. So we have a persistent record of failure from Rick Spielman. We have a persistent record of non-success from Mike Zimmer. The Vikings, because they couldn't have enough talent on defense in 2020, despite all the resources they invested, just decided to do a free agency blitz. And how responsible is Rick Spielman even for that free agency blitz, right? Because Dalvin Tomlinson is in awe of Andre Patterson, and that's why he signs. Everson Griffin wants to be with Mike Zimmer. That's the only reason he signed. So these free agency signings are not because Rick Spielman is great at enticing free agents. He's famously not very good at it. Remember when the Vikings tried to get Rick Wagner or Clint Bowling or any number of other players in? That wasn't happening. So obviously, you have to get rid of Rick Spielman, find a new way, find a forward-thinking general manager that understands the integration of scouting and analytics in a way that Rick Spielman thinks he is, but clearly hasn't been able to perform, and also find a coach that's forward-thinking, that has the ability to move an offense in the modern NFL. They're a package. You have to fire or hire them together. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the vestiges of the things that you did not like about this year's Vikings in future Vikings teams.
So, what about the idea to keep Zimmer and Rick?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you take a look and you see Zimmer and you see him not performing very well, and you think, hey, man, it's about time to go. And the Marvin Lewis example is obviously very enticing. It's a very obvious one about a coach that couldn't get it done in the playoffs. But what's happened to the Bengals since then? They haven't even made the playoffs. What's happened to coaches that have been fired after making the playoffs? People like Marty Schottenheimer. The Chargers have not been better after they fired Marty Schottenheimer. The only example that you might be able to think of is maybe the Tennessee Titans, but I haven't seen them win a Super Bowl since they decided to get rid of their playoff game-winning head coach. It's hard to get into the playoffs. It's hard to find a coach that does that. And if you decide to fire a coach based off the results of one or two games in the playoffs, you're just probably not going to make the playoffs after that. It's very rare that you'll find a team fire a coach that wins in the playoffs and then make it to the playoffs again, much less win in the playoffs. It's a prisoner of the moment sort of thing. Obviously, Zimmer underperformed against Dallas, but also you take a look at Zimmer's record, and it's difficult to find a coach to get to 580, 570, especially with the history that Zimmer has. You say, hey, we give him a lot of credit for what he did with Matt Castle and Case Keenum and Teddy Bridgewater. But it's what have you done for me lately? But that frankly, the Vikings have won recently. Like the fact that, they were 500 last year in a pandemic season where they weren't able to get who they wanted on defense doesn't elude the fact that they were able to beat the Saints in the playoffs. It doesn't elude the fact that the Vikings still have a 25% chance of making the playoffs now, even though they were the subject of close losses that weren't even their fault. I mean, is it Zimmer's fault that Dalvin Cook fumbled? Is it Zimmer's fault that Evan McPherson made every kick for the Bengals? Is it Zimmer's fault that there was so much wind in the stadium that you couldn't trust a kicker to make a 37-yard kick? Like it's not Zimmer's fault that they're not 5-2, right? Like these are teams that the Vikings have gone against that are leading the AFC and leading the NFC, that they collectively, those two games against the Bengals and the Cardinals, they collectively held them to within 1 point. And you're talking about a team that's underperforming. How can a team underperform if it doesn't have talent? Who brought in that talent? Rick Spielman. Like it's obvious that you can say, hey, Rick Spielman brought in these players because they're so enamored with Zimmer, but players love coaches around the league. Why do they come to Zimmer's team? It's not necessarily because of just Andre Patterson. It's because Zimmer's been one of the best at manipulating the cap to create the kind of space to bring in players like Dalvin Tomlinson and Michael Pierce, who have been playing very well for the Vikings. So to say they've underperformed is only an admittance that they have talent. And who brings in that talent? Rick. So I don't know why you'd want to fire a successful coach. Teams that fire successful coaches don't go on to become successful. That's ridiculous. The idea that one coach is responsible for why you win or lose in the playoffs based off of just these random, arbitrary one-game samples, that's ridiculous. Coaches win games. Zimmer wins games. Keep Zimmer. He'll find a way to win in the playoffs.
What about the idea that the Vikings should just have a big old fire sale right now?
Hey, if the Vikings are so good at acquiring talent, why aren't they so good at selling talent? They should be able to sell talent. They've got an opportunity to grab some picks for some of the most interesting drafts that we're gonna come up with. Maybe the quarterback situation is not that amazing in the draft, but I think you still take a shot, especially some of the dynamic talents like Malik Willis. But the only way you're going to be able to do that, especially if you're going to be a 500 team, is if you decide to take advantage of the assets you have that are not going to help you 3 or 4 years down the road. Take advantage of the assets you have and move them for picks. I mean, there is no team better positioned right now than the Philadelphia Eagles, despite the fact that their roster is garbage. Why? Because they've got 3 first-round picks, and all 3 of them might be in the top 10. There is no better situation in the NFL than that. I can't imagine a head coach not wanting to take advantage of that kind of talent. And the Vikings are in a position to put themselves there, right? They don't have to sell every single high-value veteran. Maybe you keep Eric Kendricks because he's a glue guy. But Anthony Barr's not going to be here after this year. We've got the trade deadline coming up. Why don't you trade him? There's some teams that still think of him as a pass rusher. You've got Harrison Smith in here. Teams still love him. Why don't you trade him? He's probably not going to be around for very much longer, and he's the other end of his career. You take a look at players like even Adam Thielen, who's obviously you don't want to let go of a Minnesota homegrown guy, but there are teams that could use a second or third receiver with Adam Thielen's talent, or even a first receiver based off of the nature of their offense, because he's so talented. They might be able to get a second or third round pick, despite the fact that he's 30, 31. You end up with all of these second or third round picks based off of the kind of talent that the Vikings have. Get rid of one of the nose tackles that you just signed, Michael Pierce, Dalvin Tomlinson, run a modern NFL defense, and you'll be able to draft your next cornerback of the future, your next quarterback of the future, your next defensive tackle of the future. Pair them with players like Danielle Hunter. Pair them with players like Eric Kendricks. Pair them with the kinds of players that can teach them how to win football games and play defense, and you've already taken care of a lot of the defensive problems.
And finally, what about the idea that we should wait until after Baltimore before you do anything drastic?
I don't understand why you would need to make a move now. Obviously, the trade deadline's coming up, but it's kind of a fantasy to think that NFL teams want to trade for players. Yeah, you got the Von Miller trade, but there are so many players in the trade block and so few players that actually end up getting traded that the NFL has the least active trade window of all modern sports, and it's because it's so difficult to integrate players into a system that's very specific about what you do. I mean, the NFL has the most schematic uniqueness among all of these sports. You can't just have a guy come in and say, hey, you're playing receiver. We've got a bunch of different words for all the routes that you're going to run, but I trust you to know them. That just doesn't work, right? So yeah, you'll have an elite player like Von Miller get traded, but very rarely does a trade actually happen and benefit teams. I mean, like teams that do end up trading for these players, like what was it, when the Panthers traded for Jared Allen, they didn't get a ton out of that. GMs are very, very, like we're talking about how valuable these second and third round picks are. Jim's very protective of it. They don't want to give away those second and third round picks. So, yeah, you have to wait until the trade deadline, but you don't get any advantage from firing Mike Zimmer now or Rick Spielman now. You might as well wait until the end of the season, get a full season sample of what they were able to do, because one of the things that you want a coach to do is be able to turn a team around after an awful loss like that. And if you've got a good coach, they'll be able to turn a team around if they've got the kind of talent that everyone says the Vikings have. Why don't you put Zimmer to the test, see if he's got the ability to do it? The Vikings still have a chance to make the playoffs, and you could turn that 25% chance to a 30% chance to a 40% chance. If the Vikings make the playoffs this year, it's one of the best coaching performances we've seen in the state of Minnesota, regardless of the kind of talent that you have, or regardless of all the other teams that exist in Minnesota that have been struggling. This would be one of the greatest coaching performances we've ever seen. Why don't you give them a chance to do that? Because you're not going to be able to hire a new coach. There's a new NFL rule that just got put into place that teams can speak to coaches in the final 2 weeks of the season. Hey, if we're at the final 2 weeks and the Vikings are out of it, go ahead, fire Mike Zimmer, talk to some coaches about that opening. But you don't gain anything out of it. So there's no reason to do anything drastic, especially when the trade window doesn't mean anything. Like, what were the Vikings able to move? Stephen Weatherly for a future seventh round pick? Like, that's what the trade window gets you for most teams. Teams are not going to give up money to try and see if they, or give up picks to try and see if they can fit Xavier Woods in a different system that he's going to have to learn all over again. That's not going to happen. So why don't you wait, see if Zimmer can make this great turnaround, and if he can't, then that's not the coach you want, right? And then you'll have your answer. But until then, give them a full sample, see what you can do. And if they make the playoffs, how amazing would it be to be able to watch a team turn it around after going 3-4 and having one of the most embarrassing losses of the season?
Well, we're going to do something here because we got so many mailbag questions. We are going to just address them. We're just going to go full on mailbag for the review of the Cowboys game, because I don't know about you, but I don't really feel like breaking down the individual plays because that game was terrible. And
it was awful.
It was just misery on a stick. It was just bad. So we're going to group these first two questions together. Nick Howard asks, how is Zimmer still employed at this point? And our friend Jesse from New York says, I have been a long-standing Mike Zimmer fan, but after Sunday, I've had enough. Between more horrible clock management and a defensive scheme that couldn't stop a nosebleed, a.k.a. Cooper Rush, I'm ready to fire every coach in the building and start fresh. I think we have a lot of talent on both sides of the ball, so what style of head coach would best suit the playmakers we have without a total rebuild? Offensive, defensive, old school, new school, and is there anyone you've seen on the horizon you see as a potential fit? We had talked earlier before the show started that even the hardest, hard-line Zimmer defenders are now having to start to walk back their takes as to their position on Zimmer, because it seems like the writing is on the wall.
Yeah, I think any move the Vikings make at this point in the season, that is, I should say, is the right move. It's all justifiable, right? Obviously within the conceivable range of outcomes. Like if they promoted like the quality control assistant to head coach, that would not be defensible. But within the range of reasonable outcomes, if they fire Zimmer, totally understand it. If they fire Spielman, totally understand it. If they keep both for the bulk of the season, totally understand it, right? I think all of those moves make sense. There is now an advantage, like I mentioned, to firing a coach partway through the season that there didn't exist in previous seasons. And that rule was made at the owners' meeting like this right before the weekend, right? And so this is a completely new advantage rule that starts in this hiring cycle, where teams can now speak to coaches in the final 2 weeks of the season instead of having to, wait for wild card weekend and hope that one of the coaches is on bye and then wait until the end of the Super Bowl or whatever, right? They can now speak to those coaches in the final 2 weeks of the season. Great. But you don't have to fire anybody up until that point. At the same time, if you're sick of something, you're sick of something, right? Like the Vikings' ability to miss opportunities is essentially, it's legendary, right? They miss opportunities better than maybe any team in professional sports. And for you to be like okay with that, I don't know. There's probably just not that many Vikings fans okay with that, including ownership. And so, does it make sense to keep Zimmer for whatever reason? Yeah, I think so. You don't get a bunch out of it, and there might be a small chance of a turnaround or something like that, right? But if you fire Zimmer, I think that you might be able to send a message, right? Because you're not like Cleveland used to be, where they fired coaches after 1 or 2 years. You're not sending a signal that you're an unstable organization to work for, right? The fact that the Wolves stuck with Zimmer through quarterback injuries and through 500 seasons and, whatever, after like 6, 7, 8 seasons, tells coaches that are interviewing for the job that they're not going to be out the door the very next year, right? After a mistake, maybe something they can't control. The Wolves have been very sympathetic to that. The resume is there. The credibility is there for them to be able to say, hey, we're going to give you the tools you need. Obviously, if you don't perform, that's going to be it. But we're going to give you a long leash. And so you don't have to constantly be looking over your back if you happen to have like one bad season or whatever, right? And so you've got the credibility to do that partway through the season, firing Zimmer without looking like an unstable organization. And you might be able to see if Andre Patterson is a good interim coach. And I don't love that idea. I know we got that in the mailbag somewhere too. Just because it's not that I don't think Andre Patterson could be a good head coach. He could be, right? But there's a weird impact or a weird effect, the interim coach effect, where interim coaches, just because of the nature of what happens when you fire a coach, you only fire a coach after a team has been disappointing. And a team's usually disappointing, like I said, because they're expected to do better. Well, an interim head coach may not coach any better, could even coach worse and generate more wins because the ball just happens to bounce the other way. Dalvin Cook doesn't fumble. Greg Joseph makes the kicks, right? The ball could bounce the other way, and they could start winning games, and you could say, hey, this new coach gets it. They understand. And a lot of those interim coaches don't end up working out. Freddie Kitchens is the most recent example, but we saw that with the Vikings with Leslie Frazier. He did a pretty good job as an interim coach. The Vikings hired him on long term, and it didn't work out. It's just the product of chasing regression, right? Most coaches, after they get fired, or most teams after they fire a coach, get better, right? Either that's the next season or during the season, because you fire a coach under extreme circumstances, and they're usually at their lowest point. They're bound to bounce back for whatever reason. So, yeah, maybe if you can separate yourself from that in the evaluation, go ahead. But remember how mad people, me included, people were that the Cleveland Browns were considering not hiring Freddie Kitchens after he turned around the Browns. Then they hired him, and they were awful. You could say that you'll evaluate all of that independently, right? But if Andre Patterson makes a run and goes like, 10 games left? If he goes like 7-3 or something, how can you not hire him? Like, it would be so difficult. Public pressure, private pressure, whatever. So difficult not to hire him if he goes 7-3. And so I don't love the idea of firing a guy just to let an interim essentially audition, because you're not getting a very good audition, and you can have your hand forced if, like, say you don't actually like some of the stuff behind the scenes. It doesn't have to be scandalous, but maybe you don't like the management style, or maybe you don't like the focus on defense, the way you don't like the way that they're doing game planning or whatever. It doesn't have to be scandalous, but if you don't like some of the stuff behind the scenes that you don't get to see, that don't end up actualizing that year, you end up being forced to hire somebody that you decide is a bad candidate. So there is that. But still, if you can kind of divorce yourself from that, you do give yourself that opportunity. So I think anything the Vikings do is totally justifiable. It's pretty reasonable. I tend to wait on these sorts of things. Obviously, if you've been listening to the podcast, I'm comfortable waiting. But if the Vikings make a decision, they got to trade everybody now, right? Because the trade deadline's coming up. So they have to trade everybody basically by the time this episode gets published. And if they don't do that, there's not much benefit to getting a new coach or an old coach or keeping the same coach. So you might as well keep the same coach and see if he can make something of it. Because if he can, I mean, that would be dope. That would rule. Like if the Vikings stomp Baltimore, sweep Green Bay, and I know that this seems like way out of line of the realm of possibilities because of what we just saw against Dallas, but I think it's totally possible given the talent that they have. If they do those things, right, and they make the playoffs as maybe not the 7th seed, maybe the 6th seed, probably not the 5th seed, but somewhere, and then they win a playoff game, that sounds cool. I would love to watch that team. And I think it's entirely possible. So I don't think it's likely, but I just don't think there's a huge benefit either to firing. And if you get to those final 2 weeks, right, if you get to even week 14 and you're not seeing what you want to see, then you can fire them then, right? It's no skin off of anybody's back. Install the interim coach, interview guys, and now you've got a 4-game sample of the interim coach, and now you've got a bunch of guys you can interview, and you're totally fine. So whatever they do, I'm totally fine with it. Fire Zimmer tomorrow, right? Makes sense to me. Sucks. I actually like Mike Zimmer, like, as a person. But, I totally understand it. So whatever they do makes sense. In terms of like who do I see on the horizon as a potential fit, I know that Chad is going to be working on a piece along those lines. If the Vikings decide to go in that direction, and I'm helping him with that. So I don't want to like give away a bunch of like paywall stuff. But I mean, they're pretty obvious candidates that I like. Like I like Kellen Moore, right? Like he's an innovative offensive mind. He did some pretty good things, not just because the Dallas Cowboys beat the Vikings. It's something I've liked for a bit. But I'm open to a bunch of things. I'm not as sold on Eric Bieniemy as a lot of people are. I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more before I like say stuff that I regret that I didn't do enough research on, because it's easy to promote a guy without having to worry about getting in trouble. But I don't want to like slander a guy without getting everything straight. So, but I'm a little bit cautious about that one. But there's all kinds of offensive minds that you could take a look at. I'm a little bit less enthused about like Lincoln Riley, not just because of how Oklahoma handled the first half of the season, but just because like Cliff Kingsbury does not strike me as a great coach, despite how well the Arizona Cardinals doing, and obviously we're seeing what Urban Meyer's doing in Jacksonville. Maybe the college to NFL thing actually is real. So I'm not like crazy enthused about it, but I like a lot of these things, and maybe you could end up hiring somebody like a Brandon Staley. Or something like that. Not him specifically, but somebody that with like that kind of background where you've got a forward-thinking coach, but you don't necessarily know what their resume is, and that's fine because resumes don't do a very good job of telling you how good a head coach somebody is.
Here's a random thought. With offensive head coaches specifically, when they get in trouble, when they're on their way out, they get play calling taken away from them. You don't hear about that from defensive coaches very often. What if we just, took the playbook away from Zimmer there and just let him be the head coach?
That would be interesting. And I think maybe that would be the sign, actually, because Zimmer still hasn't, as far as we know, given up defensive play calling, right? Maybe one day we'll learn that he did. And so maybe the Wolves are like, hey, ultimatum, you need to turn this around. What can you do to become a better head coach? That you're not doing now. And maybe he says, well, I can give up play calling, right? Like that could be it, right? If he can't trust Andre Patterson, the co-defensive coordinator, or I guess his son, the other co-defensive coordinator, to call plays on defense, like, I don't know why you promoted them. So that could be it. Maybe that's kind of the last gasp, right? What would be hilarious is if he becomes really good at clock management, right after that. And now that he no longer has to focus on getting the defensive call it.
Like that's the one thing that was holding him back. Like all of a sudden he becomes just this giant genius on time management.
Well, yeah, now he doesn't have to juggle 8 different things. Like that, it's plausible. That's the funny part.
That's funny. Bethany Miller asks, did Drew Brees do the skull chant clap before the game to curse the Vikings as payback for the miracle?
100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Not even a question of it. Although I enjoyed. I was watching the opening with my brother, and he didn't recognize Drew Brees initially. And I said, you realize who that is, right? It's like, no, he has more hair now. It's like, oh. So take that. Drew Brees is not taking his retirement sitting down. Apparently, he's getting plugs. Iowa Josh asks, did anyone else just realize that Kubiak Jr. is not the same as his dad and not a seamless transition?
I appreciate that, honestly. Like, not just because it's like more interesting and less boring that way, but also like, I feel like if he's not asserting himself, like, what's the point, right? Like, obviously, Gary retired, right? So it's not like the Vikings moved on and got the same thing, right? But like, if he can't bring new ideas into the system, and obviously some new ideas are going to be bad, but if he can't bring new ideas in, then like, what value would he provide? I mean, you can get a guy to hang out with Gary Kubiak forever. The Vikings have 4 of them on the coaching staff that have hung out with Gary Kubiak forever. And so they know how he's going to do stuff, right? You can get a guy to do that. Is it a seamless transition? I don't know, because like, I don't think it would be fair to ignore the fact that the first 4 weeks were really good, right? Offensively, like quite good offensively. And so is it rocky in these most recent 3 weeks or whatever? Yeah, but I don't know if that's a transition issue, right? Like, what if it's a Kirk Cousins issue? What if it's an offensive line issue? It could be a Clint Kubiak issue, but I don't know if that's necessarily a transition issue, right? So, yeah, he's not the same as his dad. I think that's cool. The fact that the Stefanski and Gary Kubiak offenses were very similar was nice for the Vikings because the Stefanski offense was working. But if you can introduce new concepts, then you should not be coaching. And I'm glad that he was at least able to do that, even if maybe the new concepts aren't working, because I guarantee you that the old concepts, if they were run 3 consecutive years in a row, would not be working when Sean McVay found that out. And he's adapted since then. So, yeah, I wouldn't say it's the transition is the problem here, though.
Well, let's go to Ben Greenhagen, who asks, how much of last night's result is on the Cowboys having a pretty good defense rather than the Vikings having a bad day on offense?
Yeah, I mean, the Cowboys' defense is good, right? They led the league in turnovers per drive heading into the game, but they are not as good as that, right? Because the Vikings' offense was pretty good entering the game. The Cowboys' defense was pretty good entering the game, and the Cowboys' defense put up like an all-time performance in a non-turnover fashion, right? They entered the game 7th best in the NFL on third down, 35.7% conversion rate on third down on defense. And in the game, the offense could only manage a 7.7% third down rate. Like, that's not the Cowboys just being good, right? That's also the Vikings being bad. They also had one of the worst yards per passing attempts in the NFL, 27th highest at 8.15 yards per passing attempt, right? And that was the thing about the Cowboys defense, is that you could say bend not break. I just heard it so many times during the Manning cast, I don't want to, but they were comfortable giving up a ton of yards for the opportunity to get a turnover. And the Vikings turtled. They decided that the turnovers were too risky, so that they would play conservative. And I say they. We'll break it down more specifically into who is they in that scenario. But the Vikings only managed 5.26 yards per passing attempt. So the Vikings played worse against the Cowboys defense, despite being a good offense, theoretically, and certainly talent-wise. But they played worse against the Cowboys defense than the collective previous 7 weeks or 6 games that the Cowboys had played. So it's not just the Cowboys having a pretty good defense. The Vikings also had to have had a bad day. Like, the Cowboys do have a good defense, but the way that they played the Vikings, it was kind of like an all-time defense. So no, it wasn't just because the Cowboys had a pretty good defense. A lot of it has to do with the Vikings offense. I'll have a piece coming up at The Athletic that goes into some aspects of that, some elements of that play calling on offense, or the quarterback or the offensive line or whatever. I'll talk about some of those elements as to how the Vikings offense failed. But the Cowboys defense played well, but they did not play 1 of 13 on third down well. Like, that's not how well they played. The Vikings offense has its own burdens to bear on that question.
Man, there was just so many checkdowns, and so, like, which isn't to say that Kirk Cousins didn't have a few really nice aired out plays. He even went for some contested balls. Like, there were a couple of really nice plays, but man, did everything feel like it was just dink and dunk, screens for the sake of screens that didn't end up going anywhere.
Yeah, and Kirk Cousins had like an average depth of target of 4.5, right? Which is like insanely low, right? Like I think the only lower this week, and I can double check that as I'm talking, but I think the only lower one this week was Mike White, who is like backup, but honestly like a third stringer. Yeah, like Cooper Rush, right? Like a third stringer for the New York Jets, right? They just ran a bunch of screens. Michael Carter had like a great day for the Jets. But like that was basically what it was, right? Was that the Vikings had one of the lowest passing targets. They were one of the least aggressive in week 8. And I'm going to take a look at air yards per target, which is ADOT. And the Vikings so the next gen or the RBs don't matter ADOT is a little bit different than the air yards per target thing from True Media, which is what I'm using, because they include like some plays with penalties and stuff like that don't count. And I think that they include throwaways where the RBs don't matter, might not, or vice versa. And so they have Kirk Cousins with 5.5 ADOT. Either way, it was the 7th lowest of the week. That includes Sam Darnold at 4.88, Trevor Lawrence at 5.17, Mike White, like I mentioned, at 3.67, Daniel Jones at 3.66, which we just saw that game. Daniel Jones did not attempt to throw the ball downfield at all. Jameis Winston had a very screen-happy game in a very un-Winston-like scenario, like 1.8 air yards per target, a bunch of balls to Kamara. But yeah, that was it. And then, of course, Aaron Rodgers, which was very funny until, of course, the Vikings lost doing that. But one other element to look at is the next-gen stats aggressiveness index, which does not look at how deep the targets are downfield, but rather looks at how tight the passing windows are. So you can kind of combine the two to get like an overall aggressiveness kind of understanding of the way that a quarterback played. And Kirk Cousins had the lowest aggressiveness index of the week. And so it's not just that Kirk Cousins checked it down a lot, which he did. He also did not challenge tight windows very often. And then when you take into account how far away the third downs are, right? Because if someone throws it 2 yards on 3rd and 1, you're not like upset about that. Like you could say, hey, you could have done something better there. But you're not like, you don't believe that they like screwed the offense by throwing 2 yards on 3rd and 1, right? That converts if that's a complete pass. So if you take into account the context of where the sticks are, and this is going to be a big part of my piece, Kirk Cousins threw negative 5.2 air yards to sticks, which is to say that he threw it on average 5.2 yards before the line to gain a new set of downs, which was the lowest in the NFL of week 8. It was the least aggressive by passing window, least aggressive by down and distance marker, and like the 6th least aggressive by general depth downfield overall. It was an insanely check down heavy offense. And as a result, Kirk Cousins had a relatively high completion rate, kind of at 65%. And his expected completion rate of 67% meant that he had a negative completions above expected in this game. So, yeah, super conservative offense. And I'm going to be including a bunch of I'm going to try to combine a bunch of these elements together to get a full picture of how the Vikings did in week 8 and what exactly they did. I'm going to include some film pieces and stuff like that, which I'll talk about more in some of these other questions. But yeah, very much the offense or Kirk Cousins was extremely check down happy in this game, or screen happy too. That was part of it, is that there were a number of screens in the game.
And if you look at the Vikings defense, it almost seemed like they were spotting the Cowboys a couple of yards just to try to keep things interesting. Like
Yeah,
ignoring the fact that the Vikings seem to just, if once they get up by a couple of points, they don't want to they're too polite to try to score again.
right. Yeah.
But like it very much seemed like every pass that Cooper Rush was throwing out there was being caught, and the receiver was, had already had a lot of separation.
Yeah, Cooper Rush ended up with 325 passing yards, of course. I mean, it was on 40 attempts. It wasn't like it was on 30.
Ridiculous for any backup to walk into US Bank and be able to get over 300 yards of passing.
Yeah.
One of the passes, okay, like what was it, 70 yards? Like, I get that one, but everything after that was just, how do you give up that many yards?
Yeah, it was nuts. The what is it? The overall like yard per attempt for Cooper Rush was one of the higher ones of the week. It wasn't the highest, but he ranked 8th in the NFL week 8 in yards per attempt of anybody with at least 10 attempts. And like, the leaders include Kyler Murray and Matthew Stafford and Tom Brady. Like, those are the people ahead of him. Also, very funny, Mike White and Davis Mills. But those are the guys that are ahead of them in terms of week 8 yards per attempt. I mean, he had a fantastic game, and he didn't have to throw he ended up throwing like 7 deep passes, and he didn't really need to, right? Because some of these short passes, like you mentioned, had a fair amount of yards after the catch, right? So he had 7 deep passes, only completed 3 of them. One of them, like you said, went for 73 yards. But like another one, Amari Cooper, 33 yards at the end of the game. That one, you're just like, okay. I don't even know if Bashaud Breeland had an awful game, but like that one, you're just like, oh, I guess, right? Because he bobbled it 8 times before catching it. Bashaud Breeland got a hand on it. And like, obviously he should have played that a lot better. But at the point, you're just like, yeah, I mean, the refs believe the Vikings should win, but the football gods believe the Cowboys should win. And I guess they get, judicial primacy on this one, right? Like, I guess they get the final say. But yeah, like the deep pass to Amari Cooper against Bashaud Breeland in the second quarter, like that was just like, you just gave that one up, right? Like you didn't need to. Breeland was a big problem in this game. Dancer was a problem too. Breeland a bigger problem. But yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of plays where they just gave up yards after the catch, or like the deep throws, or with the Cedric Wilson one, like both. The Vikings didn't get as much pressure as they needed to. They were like 25, 26% or something like that. One of the lowest of week 8. Whereas the Cowboys on the other side of the ball got like a 40% pressure rate. Some of that has to do with the fact that the Vikings play calling held onto the ball a little bit more. There's a lot more play action in this one. And I'd be okay with that if Kirk Cousins was willing to be explosive with the play, but he checked it down on those play action boots too. And so you get all of the negatives of holding onto the ball too long and none of the benefits. Whereas the Cowboys got rid of the ball fairly quickly, didn't give up a lot of pressure, even though they had a backup left tackle in there. I mean, Everson Griffin was the only one having a good game. And on top of that, the Vikings corners couldn't cover, right? Like I think, Amari Cooper got 95 yards against Bashaud Breeland, got 27 yards against Cameron Dantzler, and CeeDee Lamb got 44 yards against Bashaud Breeland, 33 yards against Cameron Dantzler. You even saw some stuff with the tight ends, but obviously the Cedric Wilson one. But he also got like another catch. Like 15 yards against Mackenzie Alexander, something like that. So, I mean, altogether, the Vikings gave up an obscene amount of yards after catch, right? So Bashaud Breeland gave up 28. Or not Bashaud Breeland. Amari Cooper earned 28 yards after the catch. CeeDee Lamb earned 16 yards after the catch. Ezekiel Elliott earned 29. Tony Pollard got a fair amount of play. Like it's just the amount of yards that the Vikings were able to give up after the catch, as well as how much cushion they gave on a lot of these passes. Just absurd.
Yeah, unpleasant, uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable.
Let's go to Christopher Wiley, who asks, so as far as I can tell, the Vikings decided they needed to be doing more self-scouting during the break, and they somehow came to the conclusion they weren't playing conservatively enough. How far are we from just running 3 times and punting every possession?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to take a deeper look at kind of what the reason behind that conservative level of play calling is. But based off of me just looking at third downs, right? Like the thing I like about taking a look at third down film is what the goal is, right? On first down, it could be hey, we're going to try a deep shot. If it's not there, you check it down, and you'll try to convert on second down, right? You know that there's like a bunch of options that are comfortable for quarterbacks to take on first down. On third down, you have to convert, right? And that's what I like about taking a look at third down film. And you know where the sticks are, so you know how many yards you have to get. And most of what I'm seeing, I would argue, is on Kirk Cousins for being too comfortable taking the check down based off of what I'm seeing, right? So one of the first third downs I looked at where he checked it down. So I should say this. One of the things I found out when taking a look at this yards to the sticks on third down specifically, is that Cousins only threw past the sticks on third down on a play that counted, right? So there was a penalty against Justin Jefferson on third down that doesn't get counted in these statistics. But that was also in the first drive. But the only time that the Vikings threw past, or Kirk Cousins threw past the sticks on third down, was in the first drive, right? The one that doesn't count to Jefferson, and the 31-yarder to Tyler Conklin, the contested catch against Jaron Kearse. That was it. There was one where he threw exactly to the sticks. I believe that was the KJ Osborne catch and release, or whatever you want to call it. There were two where he threw it 1 yard prior to the sticks. One of them was the Adam Thielen slant that I don't really blame anyone for. It's just a good defensive play. It might have been a penalty. Adam Thielen wanted it to be. Didn't end up mattering because the Cowboys ended up committing a penalty on fourth down and giving the Vikings a new set of downs. But other than that, other than the two within 1 yard, the one at the 0 yard line, the Vikings generally threw 3 yards or fewer, or 3 yards or more away from the sticks before they had the ability to convert. It was one of the least aggressive third down offenses I've ever seen. And I've watched Christian Ponder play, right? And he threw well short of the sticks a lot. Teddy throws short of the sticks, right? He's one of the leaders in throwing short of the sticks on third down. And there's a lot of instances where you can be comfortable with a quarterback throwing short of the sticks on third down, right? If there's a lot of space underneath, right? And you've got, a speedy guy like Mike Wallace on a crosser. Like, one of the things Mike Wallace was actually good at in Minnesota were these crossing routes, right? And you throw to him on a crosser, he gets the ball 5 yards deep on 3rd and 7. He's gonna convert it, right? You're comfortable with that, right? Or, the coverage is just very sticky, right? Deep downfield. So you have to dump it off, otherwise you're going to take a sack, right? Or throw an interception, right? Or it's 3rd and 24, and it's not like reasonable to expect that, so you're setting up for a better punt or a field goal. Or it's the end of the game and you're down 2, and you're just trying to improve the odds of your field goal, right? Like, there's a bunch of situations where it makes sense. And I took a look at all 9 of his throws in third down, right? And there were maybe 2 or 3 where I didn't really feel comfortable blaming Cousins. One of them included that Osborne one, right? And that Adam Thielen one early. But most of them, I really feel like Cousins just didn't take advantage of his opportunities. There was pressure on some of them, and he needed to get rid of the ball earlier. But there were some times where he held on to the ball, there was an open receiver, and then he invited pressure, and then he throws the ball away. And so you take a look at it on a spreadsheet, which, of course, is what I'm doing because that's what I do, and you see 5 yards short of the sticks, pressure on the snap, completed pass doesn't convert. And you think, well, if the pressure arrives early and you have to get rid of the ball before the route develops, that's not really on Cousins. But if Cousins is holding on to the ball and there's an open receiver as he's breaking open and he doesn't see that guy, that's on him. And then he holds on to the ball and then the pressure arrives and then he throws it short. And then it's like, well, the reason they didn't convert a third down wasn't because of the pressure. It was because of Cousins. And so there were most of those scenarios, Cousins throws it short. Well, he threw it short every single time. But most of those scenarios, he threw it short because of, I think, a problem with Cousins. Now, there are some difficult throws that I'm essentially asking him to make. But, you're losing, and it's third down. They're going to be difficult throws, so make them. There's one where, and this is kind of one of the issues or I shouldn't even say issues. This is just characteristic of who Cousins is. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's really bad. But there's one play on third down where Cousins makes what you would call the textbook correct read, because Adam Thielen is essentially running a route into a triangle of defenders. And so he is, quote unquote, covered, right? And so Cousins throws it because there's a key, it's a route combination where you've got a defender in conflict. And if the defender gets dragged by one receiver, you throw it to the other receiver. And that's exactly what Cousins did. He throws it to, I think it's KJ Osborne, but he throws it to another receiver that's not Adam Thielen. and that one's short of the sticks, and it doesn't convert, right? Because those three guys that were covering Thielen, they all have an opportunity to tackle this guy now. But Thielen breaks open, right? Like, he just breaks open because the guy's leverage is not such that he really has an opportunity to make a play on the ball if Cousins throws this tight window. And it is a very tight window. And he has to throw it within a 0.2 of a second. He has to make that decision within 0.2 of a second and get the ball out on time. But I know he can do it because I've seen him do it multiple times. And also, it's third down and you're losing. So you don't have a choice. You have to do it. And he doesn't do it. And there's 2 times, I think, out of those 9 throws that I looked at, where it's a tough throw that I'm asking of him, and he doesn't do it. And that's on him, right? Because the play caller called plays that went beyond the sticks. Most of the receivers are running routes beyond the sticks. That's what I noticed when I was that's the first thing I was taking a look at on these third down plays, except for the screen passes, and I'll talk about that separately. But on the plays that aren't screen passes, receivers are running routes past the sticks. Some of them are open, and Cousins isn't throwing them. Right? Sometimes they're not open, and Cousins is throwing short of the sticks because that's the only one open. Fine. Cowboys won that round. Great. But a lot of this, I think, was on Cousins in this game. And the thing is, I'm comfortable saying that Cousins wasn't at fault in some of these games, right? Like, what was it? Last year, was it the second game? It wasn't the Chicago Bears game, which I think was the 4th game. The second game was a disaster, and I said it wasn't Cousins' fault or something like that, and I wrote a big piece that I didn't think it was Cousins' fault, and a bunch of people got mad. And then 2 games later, I said it was Cousins' fault, right? The Bears game, and then a bunch of people got mad. Because, you blame somebody, and then everybody who doesn't like that gets mad. It's fine. But so I'm comfortable saying it's not Cousins' fault in some of these scenarios. I really think, at least as far as third down goes, Cousins really dropped the ball. He was just too risk averse. Like, yeah, okay, Trevon Diggs baits quarterbacks into throwing to receivers that might look open but actually aren't, and then it's a pick. Well, the response isn't to lose, right? The response isn't to throw short, right? The response is to be calculated in your risk, not to take risks. So that's what happens on these in this conservative offense that the Vikings ran. Some of it is how bad the offensive line is, 100%. Some of it is that, you should be calling better plays so that the coverage isn't sticky like that, and adjust your plays so that the Cowboys can't anticipate what you're doing with your routes. So there is a play calling element to it. But if receivers are open, on time, and Cousins has a throwing platform, right? Like if there isn't a defender in his lap and he doesn't throw it, that's usually his fault.
That play that you were mentioning, the third down play that Thielen was able to actually get open for, are you sure that wasn't the one that ended up going to C.J. Ham inexplicably, or was that, or did this happen twice? Because the pass to C.J. Ham, where Thielen was open past the stripe, just amazed me. And it's
okay, yeah. So that one was actually not on third down, but you're right. That is amazing. That, like, what in the world? And the thing is, I tweeted out that Thielen was wide open, and then so I tweet that out, and then my eyes snapped to the broadcast, the TVs that are in the press box, to see if I missed something or whatever, right? And he looks even more open on the broadcast tape, right? Because there is a defender behind him that the camera can't catch.
It hurt just looking at. It hurt watching it. And again, I'm a huge CJ Ham. I celebrate the guys that I'm wearing his jersey to Baltimore. This was one of the dumbest. Why would it was indicative of the entire Kirk Cousins experience.
CJ Ham had 3 catches for 3 yards. I want to make that clear. 3 catches for 3 yards.
Are we sure that did he actually outnumber the number of catches that Justin Jefferson had, or did they tie? Because I've seen competing stats out here on that.
Well, Justin Jefferson had more targets but fewer catches.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, so CJ Ham had 3 catches, Justin Jefferson had 2. I tweeted out right before the show. I mostly tweeted it because the way Trevon Diggs was acting was like hilarious and also disrespectful, and the Vikings totally deserve that disrespect, right? But he does not move after this. He's just standing still after the snap. And it's not like sometimes an offensive lineman doesn't move after the snap because they don't want to get called for a penalty, right? If there's a false start and they think a false start occurred, Sometimes offensive linemen are coached not to move, so that the ref can't identify them as the person who did the false start, right? It's not that. Trevon Diggs wasn't confused. He wasn't, distracted. He saw a play, and he knew that Cousins wasn't going to look in his direction, so he didn't do anything about it. And Justin Jefferson runs a route against him, like he's putting an effort, right? He's running a route, right? He's like, I'm gonna head fake here. My hips are gonna shimmy in this direction. I'm gonna plant my foot this way to get him, and then I'm gonna cut up field. So he's running like a route, and Trevon Diggs just isn't interacting with it. He's just looking at the play. Like he's a spectator that happened to wander on the field, is what happened. And so Justin Jefferson breaks wide open into the end zone, nobody covering him, right? Because Trevon Diggs just does not believe that Cousins is going to look his way. And guess who was right? Trevon Diggs. Like, Cousins throws it short to Tyler Conklin on that play on the other, looking in the other to the other side of the field, right? Just Trevon Diggs gave up 65 yards in that game. It wasn't a CB1 performance. It wasn't a performance where you could say, hey, this guy's the best cornerback in the NFL. He gave up 65 yards. But when lined up against Justin Jefferson, he gave up 0 yards. Cousins didn't even look his way. Like, dude, I understand that you respect this guy. You should. If you don't respect him, you're going to lose the game, right? You got to respect the guy that has an interception streak. It's leading the NFL in interceptions. But if you don't trust Justin Jefferson to win some of these matchups, you should not be out there.
Well, I mean, look at the beginning of the game. This was they don't count toward the actual yards, but he was being penalized pretty heavily.
Right, yeah. Justin Jefferson, like, and of course, the only time Cousins looks in that direction is on a scripted play, right?
The
play is part of the script. Yeah. And so Justin Jefferson burns Trevon Diggs, which is a thing that happens, right? Because as a corner, part of what he does is he gives up yards in order to get the picks, right? And he just loses. He outright loses on the route. And so he has to pull at the jersey or whatever to prevent the reception. It ends up being a holding penalty or pass interference or whatever, right? But Diggs loses, right? That's the only reason he commits the penalty. And you don't take that as like a sign that maybe Justin Jefferson is worth targeting or at least looking at. Like, it's just like whatever it was. Like the Cowboys must have understood, hey, when the Vikings are in 3-by-1 and you show cover 2, right, or something, right? Like it could be like hypothetically, the Vikings are in 3-by-1, which means they've got 3 receivers to one side of the field and 1 receiver to the other side of the field, and you show cover 2 both pre and post snap, right? So you show cover 2 pre snap, and you actually do have 2 high safeties post snap, so you don't rotate in any way. Kirk Cousins is going to look at the 3 receiver side and go through his reads there and dump it off and not look at the 1 receiver side. The 1 receiver side is an alert for single coverage or an alert for a safety rotation or an alert for cover 3. But if the pre and post snap diagnosis of what the play is cover 2, and this is an example, I don't know if this is exactly what happened, but the Cowboys might have found out that if the pre and post snap diagnosis is cover 2 for Kirk Cousins, he's going to look to the 3 receiver side. And if that's 100% true, like if that's true 100% of the time, or if it's true often enough that a corner can decide not to play and it doesn't matter, that's alarming. You did 2 weeks of self-scouting, right? Because the Vikings always take the bye to do a heavy self-scout of their own tendencies as if they're studying an opponent. Almost every team does this, right? And they take a look at their tendencies. They take a look at what's working, what's not working, how to break their tendencies. It's one of the most important things an offense could do is that when they establish tendencies, they find ways to break them. They can look at, tells and like, what am I giving away, right? Is if my hand is in the dirt as an offensive lineman, and I see that on passing plays I've got 4 fingers in the dirt, and on running plays I've got 2 fingers in the dirt, or whatever, right? Like these small tells that sometimes veterans have the ability to pick up on, I need to clean that up, right? Or it could be like what I just described, against cover 2, Cousins always looks to the 3 receiver side, right? Whatever. If you didn't just have the 1 week during the bye, but also the Vikings said that they self-scouted as if it were a bye before the Carolina game, right? If you essentially have 2 weeks of self-scouting and you can't pick up on something like that, where a cornerback can just give up on a play, that's pathetic. And maybe that's a Clint Kubiak thing, right? But like, Cousins, my dude, Jefferson is open because Trevon Diggs doesn't believe in you. That's embarrassing.
Let's talk about something else frustrating. Natalie has a new theory that I'm a big fan of. Natalie asks, do the numbers on the stadium clocks flip to hieroglyphics like in Lost in the final 2 minutes of the half? Because the clock apparently becomes incomprehensible to our offense each week in a new and exciting way. Natalie, I wanted you to know this is my favorite question of the mailbag.
This is the best question of the week. Yeah.
That is.
And this is a spicy mailbag, dude. This is a tough competition, but this is the best question of the week by a good margin.
Because, both Cousins and Zimmer threw each other under the bus as to the reason why the end of the first half happened the way that it did. And there were a million jokes about, got that, they're going to be able to keep that timeout for later. We got 4 timeouts left. No, I wasn't even like, I was annoyed at the joke, but I was more just annoyed that this has happened. This was incredibly stupid. The fact that the Vikings had an opportunity to actually move the ball down the field, couldn't have clocked it, they had a timeout, couldn't do anything. It was just so frustrating to watch. And when you're in a situation, you often hear announcers say like this, in a 2-minute drill, you end up calling 2 plays. You end up calling the play you're going to do and the play that you are lining up for. And it was clear that there was nothing to line up for, or worse, they didn't know where they were supposed to line up. Hey, here's James's a 2-minute drill analysis. This was crap. This was just crap.
Yeah. Okay, so the thing that you're referring to about throwing each other under the bus. So, we asked after the game, hey, at the end of the second quarter, 20 seconds straight off the clock because you have a timeout left and you don't call it. We asked Kirk Cousins this. Are you not allowed, essentially? I don't remember what the wording of the question was, but it essentially was, are you not allowed to call that timeout? Are you empowered to call the timeout? And Kirk Cousins answers right away, I might add. He immediately answers, that's a Zim thing. We let Zim handle the clock. I don't know what his plan is, a couple of plays down the road or whether or not he wants to get a couple of plays in. But clock management, that's very much, kind of on the coaching staff. And Zimmer says today, Monday, that there must have been some miscommunication or something like that because the players can do that. Which, in fairness to Cousins, which is not a thing you hear me say very often. But in fairness to Cousins, Zimmer was like enormously mad at Sheldon Richardson for calling that timeout a couple of weeks ago, right? Against Cleveland, I want to say, to get lined up. And that one was the double timeout that happened the first time. The Vikings are the only team to have a defensive delay of game penalty this season. And of course, they've had it twice. And that one, Sheldon Richardson called a timeout, I believe, right? I believe that was the double timeout delay of game that the Vikings incurred against the Browns. And so Zimmer, after the game, we asked about it, and Zimmer said, players, you shouldn't be able to do that. Players aren't allowed to do that. So for Zimmer to end up saying something along the lines of, no, he can call a timeout. Either, that's a privilege reserved for quarterbacks, which is totally normal. That's like not unbelievable or anything like that. But it's either that, or there clearly is like Zimmer might not be telling the truth, which I don't believe, or Zimmer might not be communicating very well, which I do believe, or something, right? The exact quote is, he has the ability. I won't get into it, but that was a miscommunication. We should not be at a point where they've spent 4 years together and they don't, or that Kirk Cousins doesn't know that he can call a timeout. And I use Kirk Cousins in the active voice here. That's not me blaming Cousins for not knowing. It might be his fault that he doesn't know that, right? And he could just be shifting blame, but it could be his fault, right? Or it could be Zimmer's fault that Cousins doesn't know that. Because if you tell players, hey, you can't call timeouts, very often there are exceptions to rules that coaches tell players, hey, I don't let my players do X, Y, and Z. And a bunch of the players that are very important to the team know intuitively that rule doesn't apply to them, right? There's a pretty good examples of that in Brian Billick's book on the Baltimore Ravens Super Bowl run. Deion Sanders, for example. He knows that those rules don't apply to him, and good, because when he violates those rules, it's for the good of the team. Same thing with Troy Polamalu with the Steelers, right? They call a defense, and Troy just decides, you know what? No. And he's right? And so, players will generally know when those rules don't apply to them. And especially at quarterback, you got to know that when a coach says, hey, players shouldn't be calling timeouts, that doesn't necessarily mean you. And if you don't know, buddy, you've got a whole week of instant communication with the coach. You could always ask the coach, hey, I know you said all players, but I'm the quarterback. You could just, and if the Zimmer says no, then you know, right? But you gotta, if you don't know, you gotta ask. If you think that there's any ambiguity over whether or not you've got the ability to call timeout. So I don't know who's at fault for Cousins not having the knowledge that he can call that timeout. But that's bad. They spent 4 years together.
Well, I mean, and this is the season where they've spent the most time together, apparently, hanging out and
that's right.
doing
watching quarterback film with them, right?
So you'd think that maybe that topic would come up, or maybe they're just too busy watching film. Nolan Kaler asks, how much will we see for the 3 safety combos going forward, and how novel is it to do?
There's been talk about 3 safety packages in the NFL for a long time. I remember even on this podcast, way back 2012, we would talk about 3 safety packages. We would talk mostly about big nickel, which is when you'd bring in a Jaron Curse or a Cam Chancellor style safety. Obviously, Cam Chancellor was always going to be on the field given his talent level, but the similar style of safety. And you would have him come in as somebody that has the ability to defend the run, but as a safety, but also has better coverage skills than your typical linebacker. And that kind of washed out of, it didn't happen very often. The New York Jets were kind of known to do that with Harold Landry, but it didn't become very popular, and it became less important as linebackers got lighter, right? Because it used to be that a 225-pound linebacker was way too light to play the position. This was not that long ago. And now that's kind of the ideal weight for a linebacker. And you've got some linebackers that weigh 218, 212, right? The Vikings just played against one of the lightest linebacker units in the NFL, in the Dallas Cowboys. And right before that, played one of the lightest linebacker units in the NFL, the Carolina Panthers. And, players like Keanu Neal and Shaq Thompson are listed at 210, 212, 220, right? And so you don't see talk about big nickel all that much. But now with the advent of 3-3-5 defenses and other types of defenses that don't just have 4 defensive linemen, but might have another linebacker or whatever, you might put 6 defensive backs on the field, and the 3-3-5, that third linebacker might actually just be a safety. And it could be like a Keanu Neal, or it could be like a Cameron Bynum, 2 completely different types of safety, which I think Keanu Neal is officially a linebacker, and he meets with the linebackers at the Cowboys. So it's not quite the same thing, but you get what I'm getting at. So it's not a huge defensive innovation, and some teams that go dime actually put a safety on the field instead of a corner. But it is interesting that the Vikings did that. And I think it's because, and this is maybe worth asking about maybe on Wednesday, but I think it's because you want to have a coverage safety that has some man coverage capability, which I want to add, Cameron Bynum was actually pretty bad at that in training camp, despite his background as a cornerback in college, that can cover for when you've got a safety blitz, right? Xavier Woods blitzed for the first time in a Vikings uniform this weekend against the Cowboys. It resulted in a sack fumble, great move. But in order to have your safety blitz off the edge, right, you've got to have some accounting for the player that he might have to cover if whatever coverage that you call is such that you've got some man-to-man coverage, right? And so if you're blitzing that safety, you need to have somebody cover them. So a 3 safety package is one way to do it. I think we'll see it a little bit more going forward. The fact that the Vikings are really thin at corner means that the drop-off in coverage capability as you go from a corner to a safety as your 5th defensive back, or even 6th defensive back if you don't like having Nick Vigil out there on some downs, is smaller, right? Because now that you don't have Patrick Peterson and you've got to play your fifth corner or your fourth corner instead, it might be better to play your third safety.
Next question is going to be from Kenneth Allen, who asks, Eric Eager noted yesterday the Vikings defense gives up more yards per play than everyone but the Chiefs. How does that square with Arif's and some others' contention that the defense is actually middle of the pack? Do they do some things really well and others really poorly?
Okay, so I'll say this about Eric Eager on Twitter. So I love his analysis. I use it all the time. I have no problems with Eric, right? I talk to him all the time about, like, what does this mean? What does that mean? Hey, can you shed some light on this? But I will say that Eric Eager likes to stir the pot a little bit on Twitter. I'm looking at defensive yards per play given up, and I don't actually see, and I don't know if his tweet means since week 3 or if he means on third downs or whatever, right? Like, I don't know if there's a qualifier here, right? Like on first down, the Vikings give up more yards per play, right? I don't know. But looking at pure yards per play, the Vikings give up the 10th most, which is a lot, right? Relative to like other good defenses, right? But it's not first, right? The Kansas City Chiefs are first. The Baltimore Ravens of all teams are second, right? And third are the Houston Texans, right? So they give up the most. But the thing is, if those yards don't matter, then the yards per play statistic doesn't matter. And what I mean is, if you give up 7 yards on 3rd and 8, who cares? I mean, yeah, I guess you could allow a fourth down. The Vikings are famously bad on fourth down. But, the idea is the same, right? If you've put them into 3rd and 24 and they gain 20 yards, you did a good job. Like, and your yards per play suffers, right? So what really matters is the yards that matter. And how do we identify which yards that matter? Well, we take a look at whether or not the new down and distance that the team has is advantageous or not. How do we find that out? Well, luckily we have something like expected points per play, which takes care of all of that, right? If you get 2 yards on 3rd and 1, you've done your job as an offense, you've not done your job as a defense. That increases the expected points from play to play. So on average, teams score this many points at this down and distance in this field position, and at the next field position, they score this many points on average from this down and distance at the new field position. And if that is greater, that means the offense did better than an average defense, or better than an average offense. If it's lower, then the offense did worse than an average offense. So how do we square that? Well, the Vikings have the 6th best defense in EPA per play given up, right? And it's not just because of turnovers. Like, that's kind of what Dallas does, right? Is they give up yards for turnovers. They give up expected points in traditional plays in order to gain them back on high expected point plays defensively in turnovers. Well, the Vikings offense or defense also has one of the highest success. They've got the 5th highest success rate defensively too. So I think Eager's stirring the pot on this one, right? Like, I think that, and yards per play is not a bad statistic when you compare it to other really old school statistics like total points given up and total yards given up, right? It correlates a lot better with future defensive performance than those. But it correlates really poorly with a bunch of other statistics that we tend to use, like drop back expected points or total expected points or success rate or points per drive or this or that, right? So that is not that interesting to me. I'm sorry, Eric. I guess I'm calling you out, but I think you're stirring the pot on this one.
Well, let's go to the next question then, and that's going to be from Jose, who asks, did we just watch Danielle Hunter's last game as a Viking?
I thought so. That you might have seen the last game that Hunter performed in a Vikings uniform, and I'm sure he's upset with the Vikings, right? Because the reason he was holding out is because he was freshly reminded of the fact that his career is not guaranteed, that he's got some injury risk, and he needs to have a deal in place that kind of protects him. The exact same thing is the reason the Vikings didn't want to sign him to this expensive new deal for a holdout after they had just extended him, because they don't want to be on the hook for a roster liability that could be hurt, right? And so they both have reasons that are injury related that they would want to have guarantees. So Hunter wasn't very happy with the team, right? And so he was holding out or threatening to hold out. And they ended up signing a new deal that converted a bunch of his signing bonus, or a bunch of his guaranteed salary into signing bonus. The issue with that, and I think Hunter probably got screwed here. So they added 2 void years to the deal for cap accounting purposes, but it doesn't really matter in terms of like when he stops being a Viking. But the problem is Hunter can no longer hold out in training camp because there's a lot of bonuses that are essentially tied to his attendance at training camp the next couple of years, especially in 2022. So he can't hold out in 2022 because then he forfeits essentially a huge roster bonus. And so the Vikings just have that leverage. So they negotiated a new piece of leverage into the contract. Hunter did not have the leverage he thought he had when he initially expressed his discomfort with the Vikings and the way that they handled this deal going in. And so he must have accepted this. I mean, it's frankly, it's a not very good deal for Hunter. And so he doesn't have the ability to secure more for himself or secure a guarantee for himself in response to this. Which, I mean, sure, this is exactly what the risk the Vikings were pricing in when they did all this. But I don't think we did, because as much as Hunter might be upset with the Vikings in terms of his concerns being actualized, first, it gives the Vikings justification for the approach that they took, right? We were worried that this would be the case. But second, the new deal that they struck prevents Hunter from like not showing up, right? So in no way have we guaranteed that Hunter is going to be so dissatisfied with the Vikings that he's not going to go back. It could be the case. I mean, he could be able to force a trade, right? He could just become, and this is uncharacteristic of him, but he becomes such a taciturn and disgruntled employee, right? He could become a locker room problem that he could decide that he'll do a sit-in, he'll show up at training camp and he won't practice or whatever, right? He could be kind of a distraction until he gets traded. It would be uncharacteristic based off of what we know of Hunter. There are probably ways that he could force a trade or request a trade, or if the Vikings are just not very good anymore, he could just be like, look, I want out for a lot of reasons. So we might have seen the last of Hunter in a Vikings uniform, but the contract structure is such that it is much more difficult for Hunter to get out than for the Vikings to get out.
All right, let's go to Kyle Slaby, who asks, do you think the Property Brothers could fix this operation?
They don't even fix the houses that they buy. We talked about this on the Property Brothers episode, right?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, so check out that episode, which is, if you're new, an actual episode. I don't know how else to put it. We watched the Property Brothers.
That was a fantastic April Fool's episode.
Yeah, people loved it.
Yeah. Well, it had the 2D side scroller house. So
the side scroller house, amazing. I can't believe it existed.
Also, for Arif's astrology corner, Jupiter is known to grant luck, wisdom, and protection. What do we need to do?
No, it isn't.
That's the end of that. John Belk asks, could you do the talent level versus production analysis that you did for DiFilippo a few years ago? If the play calling / offensive philosophy really is what's crippling the Vikings as much as people feel, have we finally reached the point that where Zim's faults are outweighing his behind-the-scenes pluses? Also, would Kirk with McVay stop throwing passes to get fifth and manageable so often? Or is that just a fundamental core of his being?
Yeah, so that DiFilippo piece essentially took the PFF grades of the offense and compared them to the points per drive. It was a little bit more complicated, but the offensive production, right? He had to adjust for field position and stuff like that. But like, it looked at whether or not the players were performing well and whether or not that player performance was turning into points. And that analysis concluded that DiFilippo was like one of the 10 worst offensive coordinators of the analysis era, right? Which I believe went all the way back to like 2010. So 2018 to 2010. He's one of the 10 worst coordinators out of the 32 times 10 teams, right? If you could do, it's not 32 times 10, it's like 32 times 9. But anyway, so that was like the thing I concluded, but I also concluded that there were a lot of good coordinators that in their first year as a coordinator ended up pretty low. Not as low as DiFilippo. It was one of the worst that we've seen. But it found that despite the fact that the players seemed to be performing well, the Vikings weren't scoring points. And, it was pretty good. And I talked to actually Eric Eager about this. And he's got his own system that's a lot more nuanced and in-depth and takes better advantage of the PFF data that he has available to him as an employee of PFF. that kind of found some similar things. And so that would be kind of worth taking a look at. The problem is the new PFF setup, right? So in 2018, PFF had already moved to the 0 to 100 style rankings, but I had an ability to find the old plus minus system. So people who may not remember, PFF used to publish their raw grades, which was dope, was way better, I think, than what they currently do. But they grade every player, and they still do it this way. They grade every player on every play based off of a -2 to +2 scale. And it follows basically a bell distribution. So about like 68% of all player grades and all plays are a 0, right? Because you do what you're supposed to do. You do what you're expected to do. You do not do anything above or below ordinary, right? Quarterback under pressure who checks down for 3 yards probably gets a 0 on that play. Now, what the running back or whoever the check down is does with that doesn't impact the grade on that play. But, if they slip out of pressure and they fire off a deep shot and it hits the receiver in the hands, maybe that's a +1 or a +1.5. Very rarely, but on occasion, there are grades where you get a +2.0, right? But most grades are a 0. And then you have to do some adjustment where you adjust essentially for the total number of snaps that you play, because offensive linemen traditionally can only earn negative grades. Now, that's not true all the time. They can, in run blocking, get +2s and +1.5s, but typically their average grade is negative, and so you have to readjust it. And so that adjustment we didn't get access. So they would publish the adjusted version of that, but they would not publish a 0 to 100 ranking. And that data was the raw data. You did not have to disentangle it. And so that's the data I was working with to produce these numbers. And that data is a lot cleaner. It follows a normal distribution by design. It tracks a lot. If you download it and you try to perform some future-looking analytics or try to predict performance using it, it does a lot better. It's just cleaner data to work with. I don't have access to that anymore. We don't have access to that as the public. So I would not be able to do that level of analysis. You'd have to ask Eric Eager or Timo Risk or any of the other data analysts that work at PFF to do it. They still have access, obviously, to the raw grades that they have, as well as a bunch of other stuff. So unfortunately, no, I can't answer that. My intuition based off of just watching the Dallas game is that I think it's more about Kirk Cousins than it is about Clint Kubiak right now.
Next question is from Eddie Crane, who asks, is the Jets' Zach Wilson a better fit for the Vikings offense than Kirk Cousins, and vice versa?
Maybe. Wilson refuses to take the checkdowns that are in the offense that the Jets are giving him, and it's really hurting the Jets. Cousins would have no problem with that. That's a pretty good receiving group. It's not as good of an offensive line group as it should be given the draft investment, but I don't know. It kind of feels that way. They are kind of rolling out a little bit more. They want to extend plays a little bit, which Cousins is good at. But I still don't think so, because I think that they've kind of molded the offense around Kirk Cousins in Minnesota in a lot of ways that it just wouldn't work for somebody a little bit more improvisational like Zach Wilson. So I'm going to say no, but I like the thought.
We're going to start getting off the rails here. Bishop Sycamore alumnus asks, for Arif's retcon and fanfic corner, what happens if Zimmer gets fired after 2019? Does Rick stay if Kevin is hired? How would their draft strategy or free agent strategy have changed? And where would we be now? It's easy to see the Browns' success and transpose teams, but the fact is, to start 2020, these teams were on completely different trajectories.
That's pretty difficult to say, because you don't know whether or not Kevin Stefanski gets access to the Browns coaching staff and whether or not he retains members of the Vikings coaching staff. Because obviously, he's well acquainted with the Vikings coaching staff. He probably likes a lot of them. He probably doesn't think that they held him back or anything like that when he was the offensive coordinator. And so, for example, the Browns have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. And they're coached by one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL, and Bill Callahan. And how did he hire Bill Callahan? It might be because of a particular connection that somebody in the Browns front office or the Browns organization has that the Vikings don't have, right? And so he might not have even had, the ability to contact Callahan, and maybe he just likes Rick Dennison more, so he would have kept Rick Dennison. And if he acquires Bill Callahan, does the team go out and try to get somebody like Wyatt Teller, who's playing really, really well at guard? Do they try to sign Zach Conklin or Zach Conklin? Do they try to sign Conklin, Jack Conklin, who's playing right tackle for the Browns, even though they've got Brian O'Neill? Probably not, right? And so we can't really tell kind of what coaching staff he assembles if he stays with the Vikings. I do think that they keep Rick Spielman. But some elements are not analytically forward, right? They're a very run-heavy offense. It's the only team in the NFL that has like two viable starting running backs in fantasy. It's because they run the ball so much. There's so much opportunity to go around. And so there's that. So it's not as if he's a traditional, young offensive head coach that loves analytics. But at the same time, the Browns are a very analytically forward organization. They go forward and fourth down a ton, which the Vikings don't, especially not this year. I don't know. Like, I feel like we can take a look at the success the Browns had last year, maybe not as much this year, but the success the Browns had last year and say, hey, they should have held on to Kevin. And I think that's a fair argument, but you got to be careful because a lot of the stuff the Browns are doing, the Vikings don't have the freedom or wouldn't have done just because of their situation, right? Like Baker Mayfield and Kirk Cousins are operating similar offenses, but they're different quarterbacks. And so, you don't go out of your way to acquire Baker Mayfield. If you're Kevin Stefanski with the Vikings, you stick with Kirk Cousins. So it's tough, but I do think that the Vikings would probably be better offensively. They might be much worse defensively. Maybe they hire Joe Woods, and Joe Woods runs the same offense. He's got Zimmer experience, or same defense. He's got Zimmer experience. But I know that Browns fans are not super happy with Joe Woods on defense. So if the Vikings fall off defensively in a big way, are they a better team? I mean, probably, but I think that there's a lot in the air, right? Like, I think when Zimmer gets fired, and I think it's more likely than not at this point, but I think when Zimmer gets fired, fans are going to find out what it's like to have a bad defense again. And 2020 was a bad defense, but there was a good chunk of time in the middle of that season where they were good again. It's just the beginning and the end of those seasons after injury, they were pretty bad. And I think we're probably, maybe I'm wrong, but we're probably going to find out how bad the Vikings defense can be without Zimmer, because it's surprising how consistently good this defense has been over the years.
Justin asks, what deity did Mike Zimmer make a deal with to come up with that defensive scheme in the last Saints playoff game? And which part of his coaching ability will it take as payment next?
Well, it's going to take his other eye next.
I suppose that's kind of that seems likely now. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what maybe Tiamat. I don't know. The 5-headed dragon. Yeah, I mean that seems about right. Like just a general god of corruption and evil. It's a good way to deal with the Saints.
Yeah, eye for foresight makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's go to Damian Barrett, who asks, watching Thursday Night Football, the thought struck me once again that the Packers truly are the luckiest team in football. Ball bounces, ref calls, fingers barely touching footballs, etc. Is there any statistical proof of this, or is it just the rivalry coloring my perception? And given that it's definitely the former, if the Vikings enjoyed similar luck, would you enjoy it, or would each victory be tainted by hollowness, like playing a computer game with cheat mode enabled?
So to answer the second question first, absolutely not. It would not be. I would enjoy it. It would not be tainted by hollowness. The thing about a team that wins because of lucky events is we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. You very easily convince yourself that that's not the case, right? Easily. I mean, first of all, Packers fans, right? But second, I don't even know if the Packers are the luckiest team. I think Tom Brady might be the luckiest, which is not to say he's not incredibly skilled. He could be the greatest quarterback of all time. But I think part of that discussion should include the fact he's also one of the luckiest quarterbacks of all time. And that a lot of the clutch moments required above probability play from people that are not him, like Stephen Gostkowski and Adam Vinatieri and so on, right? Like Adam Vinatieri is a lot less of a clutch kicker, a lot less clutch of a kicker than you remember. But he happened to make the kick in the snow game. He happened to make a 47-yarder when nobody was making 47-yarders consistently in a Super Bowl that they only won because of that kick, right? Like, so those are two separate kicks, by the way. I'm not trying to confuse them, but I'm talking about like the tuck rule game against the Raiders, right? Brady is probably one of the luckier quarterbacks. The fact that he's also one of the best quarterbacks of all time combines to create a 7-ring dynasty, right? So it's not. I'm not saying he's lucky to take away from his level of skill, but rather that when you get to combine the two, you get 7 rings. Now, the Packers obviously benefit, I think, from luck in some of these obvious circumstances, like on Thursday Night Football. I think we saw some pretty good instances of luck that are not even like necessarily like, the finger touching the football. That's not like the refs screwing with, the other team to make the Packers win. That's just being lucky. But they also have been incredibly unlucky, right? Like, I think that you could have called the Fail Mary either way, right? I think the Brandon Bostic choosing to try and catch the onside kick and when he shouldn't have, that is an instance of bad luck. Really, I think they're luckier than they're not, but I think that we're overlooking all the instances that the Packers have genuinely had bad luck. Their starting quarterback was injured by Anthony Barr for like a season, right? Like, that's not good luck. We just remember the good luck that they've had because we hate it when it happens, and we kind of forget the bad luck. In the same way that the victory would not be tainted by hollowness if the Vikings were lucky, right? Because this season, the Vikings could have gone 5-2 or even 7-1, right? Or 6-1. They could very easily have won a bunch of these games because of good luck, right? And good luck that you don't even have the capability to think about if it happens, right? Because Dalvin Cook not fumbling is normal. You don't think it's good luck when he doesn't fumble, right? But if he doesn't fumble against the Cardinals or whatever, or if Greg Joseph makes the kick against the Bengals or makes earlier kicks and misses, the order in which Greg Joseph makes or misses kicks matters, right? And so if he makes some of these kicks and misses some other ones that don't matter as much, the Vikings are like 7-1, even if he makes the exact same number of kicks. And so we would think of the Vikings as a very good team if they were 7-1, but like they're not, and so we don't. And part of that is because they don't have good luck. I don't think the Vikings necessarily have a bunch of bad luck this year. They just don't have a bunch of good luck this year. I think it's probably about even, maybe trending on the side of bad. But it's not as if the Vikings are tremendously unlucky or tremendously lucky. But if they were tremendously lucky, we'd all be talking about how good of a team this is, even me.
Tim Watts asks, to James's depression corner, I like that I have a new corner. What new ways will the Vikings...
One of your few. Cherish it.
Wow. I'd make a comment about that, but I'm too sad. So we're going to go to James's depression corner. What new ways will the Vikings find to lose games this year? I did not think double timeouts would ever be on that list.
Plural.
Yeah, that's it is odd that it's happened twice. I think what'll happen next is...
Remember when the 49ers had 5 timeouts and a half against the Vikings?
I remember pointing that out to you at the time, being like, this is wrong. That was the replacement ref season. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go with that. No, I think that what'll happen this time is that a fan will get onto the field, and a Viking will, instead of letting security just handle it, a Viking will just lay out the player, or it'll just lay out the fan. And it turns out, due to some obscure rule that the NFL had put in place 20 years ago that's never actually been enforced except for this one time, that will result in a 5-yard penalty, which will take us out of field goal range. But we're still going to put Greg Joseph out, and he's going to miss the game-winning kick as a result of that.
That's good.
Some obscure rule will cause that's never been enforced before will only be enforced for the Vikings. It'll knock us out of field goal range, and Greg Joseph is going to end up missing it. And
that's almost what happened with the double timeout, right? Because it's not the exact same thing, but the refs shouldn't have called the timeout. They should have just let it happen. And if the refs do call the timeout, then they have to then therefore call the penalty of the Vikings and then also take the timeout away. But if they don't, and Zimmer was like very clear, hey, this is my fault. I deserve responsibility for it. But he did also say like, but if they didn't call it, I'd have that timeout in the end. I don't want to say Zimmer did not take responsibility for it because he did, but it is important to note that if the refs had not called that second timeout, if they had just ignored Zimmer, the Vikings would not have obviously incurred the penalty. And also the Vikings would have had an extra timeout heading into the final drive. And, who knows if that matters, but that it's kind of exactly what happened. Is some obscure rule screwed up the Vikings?
Yeah. Devin asks, you have to watch either last night's game against the Cowboys or the Josh Freeman game on repeat 25 times in order to be able to watch any other football games ever again. Assuming you are not planning on giving up football entirely, which do you choose to watch?
That's awful. So my question is essentially, do I remember the specifics of the game, or is the game new to me each time? And I'm not saying, do I remember how miserable I am after viewing the game? Like, it could be a scenario where you watch, say, this Cowboys game, and after the game is over, you don't remember any of the specifics, you just feel bad, and then you watch it again, right? Because I think that might change my answer. If I don't remember the specifics of the game, the Josh Freeman game, every single time, absolutely. That's so funny to me. Like, that game is so funny. It's an awful game, but there's so many dumb moments in it that you can just kind of, like, you know, heading into the game, I'm not, like, confident that the Vikings are going to win that game. Like, Josh Freeman showed up 4 days before the game started, right? Like, who knows what's going to happen? Anything could happen. It would totally make sense. And then it did, and you're like, yeah, okay, I guess. So I would love to rediscover that game over and over again. But if I remember the specifics, I think it's going to be the Cowboys game, because I think my frustration decreases over time, and I'll find something new, right? At least, like, I'll, like, hey, I know that he passes it here, this way, in this direction. Both of these are torture. Let me be clear. But, like, I think I would find something to do on, like, the 13th viewing of the Cowboys game. Maybe not the 25th, but I would find something to do.
Actually, the Cowboys, watch last night's game against the Cowboys or the Josh Freeman game on repeat for 25 times. The way that it was written, it didn't make it sound necessarily that you'd have to watch the Cowboys on 25 repeat, but let's just say for the sake of argument.
Oh, in order to be able to watch any. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let's just for the sake of argument say you'd have to watch both 25 times, and you would keep your knowledge every single time.
Okay. Yeah, I think in order to watch any other football games again, I want to keep my house, so I'm going to do this because I have to watch football for my job. So I am going to watch the Cowboys game over and over again before I can watch another football game again. But assuming my livelihood was not attached to this, probably it says on repeat, so I don't. They can't be consecutive viewings, right? Because you wouldn't have time to eat and stuff like that. But they'd be essentially consecutive viewings.
Yes.
I couldn't give up football for a couple of years and watch this game every so often up until I hit a total of 25, and then I can watch football again, right?
Right. I think I would do the Josh Freeman game as long as I got the first 5 minutes of SportsCenter afterwards, where they apologized for putting that game on broadcast TV. That would be the after dinner mint that would make everything okay. Let's go to Don from Ohio, who asks, hypothetically, let's say the Vikings decide to have a fire sale right before the trade deadline. Where would you send the following players, and what kind of draft capital would you get for them? We got Thielen, Richardson, Breland, Woods, Madison, and Barr. Also, is it true if you get the COVID vaccine, your check down pass attempts go down significantly?
The evidence suggests that it's true, so better get that vaccine so you can throw downfield. I'm just looking at the evidence. Okay, so where would I send the following players? What type of draft capital would I get for them? I don't know about where. Where is not that important to me. Maybe I'd send Thielen to Baltimore because they need receivers, and I feel like that would work. You get to hang out with Rashad Bateman. But where is not that important to me. What draft capital you could get? Thielen, because he's 30-something, I don't think he could get a second-round pick. I think he could get a third. Breland, you'd probably get a sixth or a seventh. Probably send him back to Kansas City. It looks like they could use some corners. It's not like Mike Hughes is playing for them anymore. He got the pick in week 1, then he's been worse and worse every single week. Sheldon Richardson, and he's been getting less playing time. Sheldon Richardson, maybe a sixth because he's not playing that much or as well as he should be. And I don't know. It's not like Cleveland's Yeah, send him back to Cleveland. I don't care. Xavier Woods, he's playing reasonably well. I'd say maybe you could get a fourth round pick for him, maybe a third, but I think a fourth. Where'd you send him? I don't know who could use safeties at this point. Because he could pair with Buda Baker in Arizona, which would be kind of fun to watch. I don't want to like subject him to Seattle. I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm just thinking about like going back to former teams, and like, I don't think Dallas would really want him. Uh, does Tampa Bay have a safety besides Antoine Winfield? I'm going to guess yes. Let's send Woods to the Chiefs as well, to get rid of Daniel Sorensen. Actually, yeah, because the whole point of Daniel Sorensen is that he's like super smart and he knows the defense. He just can't play. Well, Xavier Woods is crazy smart, and he could adapt to that defense really well. So yeah, send him there. Get rid of Daniel Sorensen. Alexander Madison, where'd you send him? Tennessee. Obviously, they could use a running back
to back up Adrian Peterson. There's a fun sentence.
Which you saw the CBS. Like, I can't tell if the CBS Sports tweet is bait and they got what they wanted out of all the engagement.
Or 3 years ago, Adrian Peterson was able to do this. Yeah, that's 3 years.
Yeah. So it's 40 years in football terms, in running back terms. What are you talking about? Crazy. 3 years ago, Drew Brees was still playing like a Hall of Famer. This is nuts. Yeah, that was crazy. Or if they were just like honestly tweeting that out. I'm leaning towards bait, but there is a part of me that's just like, do you think you thought you had something? But yeah, Alexander Madison to Tennessee, I think you get maybe a fifth. Like, I think that he is playing better than third round picks at running back typically do, but like at the same time, he's not like proving it out down to down. So it's tough. But so to me, that's like a fifth. Anthony Barr is the toughest one. Whatever team trades for him is only going to have him for 1 year. Same thing with Xavier Woods, but the Chiefs are in the middle of a Super Bowl run, so I think that they would pay up. I would send Anthony Barr to a place that knows how to use a blitzing linebacker. I think the Patriots are a really good example of that. Donta Hightower is, one of the best blitzing linebackers of the modern era. And I think that, Anthony Barr could pick up that role. They're also one of the only teams that knows how to use big linebackers really well. So there's that. I don't know that you could get very much for him because he's only got 1 year left on his deal. He is playing pretty well. Yeah, I thought he had a good game against Dallas. I don't know what his PFF grade was, but initial viewing, and I'm mostly looking at the offense, but the initial viewing, I actually liked what he did. Holy crap, Eric Kendricks had a great grade. Well, he did play super well against Dallas. So, but yeah, let's see what, Anthony Barr had a pretty good grade against Dallas. Like a missed tackle here or there, so that didn't help, but mostly he played well. Yeah, so I would say that because Anthony Barr is playing well, but he's only got 1 year left in his deal and he has a tendonitis issue, that's going to be a long-term injury concern. I think that without that, you might be able to get him for a third. But I think with that, it's probably a sixth, honestly, because the 1 year deal thing plus the persistent injury issue thing, it'd be tough. And so we're coming out of this without, I think, a single second round pick, right? Like, I don't think I give anybody a second round trade capital. So it's Thielen for a third, Richardson for a fifth, Breeland for a sixth, Woods for a fourth, Madison for a fifth, Barr for a fifth. I already forgot what I gave Barr, maybe a fifth. So you had a couple of fifths, a third, maybe a fourth. So yeah, that's not a beautiful amounts of draft capital, but that's what you get in a fire sale.
Well, that's what you're trying for anyway. Finally, for Arif's Little Big League Marvel's What If Corner,
what the hell?
From Jeff Swoboda, he asks for the crossover corner. Through a series of random events, Arif is notified that he is the previously unknown relative of Mark and Ziggy Wilf, and he has inherited the Minnesota Vikings after the Wilfs decide to step down and focus on their shady development deals. How do you make the Vikings a legitimate contender in the next 5 years? The only caveat is you may not employ Benjamin DiNucci during your tenure.
What?
Bonus points if you can continue the Vikings' recent tradition of nepotism and make James an underqualified coordinator.
Oh, that's amazing. I don't know what I do with bonus points. Great. But yeah, okay, James is the defensive line coach now. that position will take care of itself.
Likely.
So, yeah. Plus, James like has credibility just by virtue of his size. So I think they'll believe that he was a defensive lineman at one point.
I think
Were you, by the way?
I feel like no. I feel like the subterfuge will last longer due to my size and the defensive line group than any other place. Like I feel like,
and like offensive line is such a technical coaching position
yeah.
that's the only other area where your size might lend you credibility, and I think you get exposed immediately.
Yeah, I feel like defensive line, I just need to remind people that the game is important, and
and just like talk about a technique in vague terms that you Googled the night before, ask Daniil Hunter to demonstrate it, and then say everyone should just do that.
Yep, exactly. That's this is what we're doing. All right. Oh, Zim, you got something to say about this? Great.
Yeah, great. Yeah, do that. But yeah, as for how do I make the Vikings a legitimate contender in the next 5 years? Yeah, I mean, like I do all the analytic stuff that'll probably tank a team if you apply it to a real life team. But you know, I would hire data scientists. I would make sure that I've got an integrated analytics unit from top to bottom
to actually do the math, or are you hiring them as your like laundry crew?
But both.
I suppose. Well, the Colorado Rockies prove that the analytics group can do laundry. So
yeah, so I'm sure they'll find efficient ways to do it. No, but yeah, I mean, you hire it. Like there's a good book from Ben Alamar that talks about developing an organization, sports organization that's analytics forward. So I'd find a way to do that. But yeah, I mean, I own a team, right? People are going to want to come to me, so I'm going to cast a broad net and see like kind of what ideas people have for organizational structure and drill down on that. But like, yeah, maybe Kellen Moore's the head coach. Great. Let's do that. Unless he interviews poorly, in which case, no, he's not. Get the hell out of here. Like there's a lot of things where I'm just going to be like, I don't know, I probably got to talk to the guy before I realize what I want to do. I might promote Jamal Stevenson to general manager, right? Get Rick Spielman out of there. The important thing for me is after the season's over, I want to have one-on-one time with the coach so they can explain to me all the football stuff that's happening. And so I get true insider access that nobody else has, just for the thrill of it. Like the clause in your contract is that your job is to coach this football team to win, but also after that, teach me football. That sounds cool. I want to know about that. That's the important part.
And just make it clear to them you're not going to go full Jerry Jones on the situation and be like,
yeah, I'm not going to intervene.
No,
I'm going to hire a guy who does that. but yeah, an analytics forward front office, a coach that is comfortable with having a game clock manager. One thing I won't do is hire draft Twitter. There's like every so often there's like a thread that goes around like build your dream front office, and they tag a bunch of people in draft Twitter, and I'm just like, and I'm in a lot of these, right? And I'm just like, man, this front office sounds awful. This is terrible. We're gonna explode. Are you kidding me? It's just gonna be like a bunch of players that we didn't do any background research on, and they all get like drunk on Fridays. They all get Deweys, but their college team covered it up. And so you didn't hear about it in the public. And so it's going to be a bunch of like former Miami Hurricanes. And it's like, man, this guy is dope. His personality is great. And it does not even matter whether or not it fits in a locker room. We're going to run the worst team. It's going to be a bunch of 5-star high school recruits.
Be like, or it's going to be like the three people who really stood out at the Senior Bowl.
Right? Yeah. It's like, yeah, this team, we got Penny Hart, man. We've got the best receivers. We grabbed Penny Hart from the Senior Bowl. We grabbed Andy Isabella from the Senior Bowl. We got Denzel Mims. We got Antonio Gandy Golden. We got the best receiving core, and it's got like 20 combined yards at the end of the season.
Meanwhile, the owner is spending a bunch of money bailing out all of his staff from getting into fights with NFL coaches that weekend.
Yeah, making donations to various mayors to get them out of the criminal report and stuff like that.
Exactly. All right, well, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. We went full mailbag for your benefit and partially ours, because there was no way we wanted to review that game. So Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, so I'm going to have that piece up at The Athletic hopefully sometime soon. I'm going to submit it hopefully tomorrow morning, which means it'll come out around 1 or noon or something like that. Find me at The Athletic, theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. Or you can follow me on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I'm sure I'll promote it. But yeah, that's what I have to plug.
And remember to check us out if you are in the Washington, D.C. area. We are going to be over at Ireland's Four Courts in the James Joyce Room sometime a little after 7 o'clock on Thursday night. So check us out. Really looking forward to meeting some of you guys out there. So for Reef, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember, case cook us. And the next time you hear us, we will be live. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.